Hi and welcome to Knit with Hannah. I'm Hannah. Today we're going to start talking about yarn swatches. Hi and welcome to Knit with Hannah. I'm here with Knitting Natter to help you learn to knit the easy way. We are sorting out yarn this month. We're decluttering, and to help you with the declutter and help you understand which yarn you've got, maybe whether you want to knit with it again or not, we're going to talk about swatching yarns this next few weeks. So this first week we are going to figure out the number of stitches you want to put on your needles to create a yarn swatch. And it's just that simple. Take a look at the yarn, take a look at the ball band, fingers crossed you've still got it around the yarn, and with that ball band we can then work out how many stitches you need and how many rows you need to knit. I'll show you how I've created those calculations in the past. It's so simple, anyone can do it. It's just a case of putting a few numbers on a piece of paper. Right, so let's get straight to it. Get your pen and paper ready and you can go through this exercise with me. Most people knit a gauge square for the purpose of testing out the yarn before you knit something. So you may have, for example, 10 balls of this ready to knit a cardigan, and you just want to make sure that you're knitting with the right needles, that it all ends up the right size as you're knitting. And you will not only get this from the yarn ball band, you may have it on the ball band, but the other thing is you may find the gauge written out in your pattern before you get started. And depending on whether you're just testing the yarn to see whether you want to knit with it, or whether you are following a pattern and you want it to be the right size when you've finished, you'll take the gauge from one or the other. So let's pretend that we've got this yarn out of our yarn stash, we want to knit it up and see whether it will fit one of the patterns that we've got from somewhere else. Okay, this for example is a swatch I just did in garter stitch, not stocking stitch. But most gauge squares will be knitted so you can measure the stocking stitch part of it. What I'm going to do now is show you how I will calculate what a gauge square will look like. So we're going to have 1 square, 2 squares, and then 3 squares. I'm going to do this 3 times. Doesn't matter. Use a ruler if you want to. Doesn't matter at all. And they can be as big or as small as necessary. So for this top one, we're going to use this large yarn here. Now on 10mm needles, it's 7.5 to 9 stitches. So it's going to be more like 9 stitches to 10 for 10 centimeters. And then when you've knitted 10 to 12 rows, more likely 12 rows, you'll have knitted 10 centimeters as well. So the whole idea is that this is 10 centimeters and this is 10 centimeters there as well. So what we've got is, let's try 9 stitches, and from this I'm going to suggest that that is 12 rows for 10 centimeters. Now, if you're going to knit something, you want outside space so that that isn't the edge of your knitting. Otherwise, your 10 centimeter square is going to sit there and you're going to go, oh, I can't quite measure it. Does that work? I really need something else to measure in. So what I then do is add on 3 or 4 stitches and 3 or 4 rows. So let's add on 3 and 3 and 4 and 4. And here we need some kind of border so that it sits flat as we measure it. You can do either garter stitch, or if you like it, you can use moss stitch instead. Let's use garter stitch today. So let's have 3 garter stitches on either side. And again, let's do 4 garter stitch rows at the top and at the bottom. Actually, let's make that 6. So we're going to cast on here. We're going to knit 6 rows. We're then going to start knitting 4, 16, 20 rows, stocking stitch, and then we're going to knit another 6 rows. That's 6, and then we're going to cast off. So you're sitting there going, but how many stitches do we need? So let's figure that out now. So we have 9. We then have 3 and 3, which makes 15. We then have another 3 and another 3, which is 21 stitches. So there you go. You can see it with a calculator if you want to. You don't have to do it all in your head. So we've cast on 21 stitches. This is the Rowan Big Wool. And we're using 10mm needles. There you go. Cast on 21 stitches, knit 6 rows, stocking stitch 20 rows, knit 6 rows, and then cast off. And you will have a gauge square-ish. But it will be easy for you to measure exactly what you've got in the middle, with a little bit of room to spare on your stocking stitch, and then the garter stitch will hold it flat. This is the whole idea. We want it to be easy. We want to make it so that you can measure this once you finish knitting it, and it's not going to look strange. It's not going to be difficult to measure, and you can actually use it as a pot holder or something for your teapot when you're having your drinks afterwards. I love using my yarn swatches as coasters and all sorts of things around the house. So that kind of thing is perfect. So we will have something that will knit up to approximately, let me see, that could well be about 20 centimetres square when she finished it. Let's do another one together. Okay, so this one suggests, again, this is 10 centimetres across, this first square in the middle, and that's 10 centimetres up. That's your rows going up, and that's your number of stitches going across. Okay, so we're now doing Rowan Pure Wool Superwash worsted. This suggests size 4.5mm needles, and we're going to look at this. It says 20 stitches and 25 rows. So let's put that in the inside square there. Okay, so that's a good start. Now for this, because it's a much larger gauge, we need a little bit more. We need a few more stitches. We can't just go with 3 or 4 in the next 2 borders. So what I'm going to do is just think about how we did it here. So 9 stitches and 3, that's about a third of it. So we can go with about a third or a quarter of the number of stitches you'll get in 10 centimetres either side, and you'll have definitely enough space to measure. So what I'm going to do is add 5 stitches here, add 5 stitches here, and then we can go with 4 or 5 in the border. That's just keeping it flat. And again, up here, I'm going to choose 6 at the top and 6 at the bottom. So simply cast on, we'll do the cast on number in a minute. We're going to knit 6 rows. We're going to stocking stitch 25 rows. That's that little, no we're not. We're going to do stocking stitch 25. We haven't done that middle bit there. We're going to stocking stitch 25, 31, 37 rows. I would say let's add that up to 38. And then we need to do knitting another 6 rows. And then cast off. So we've got an even number of rows there. It does make it easier, and then you don't get confused about what you're doing when. So the number of cast on stitches, we need 20. Plus 5 is 30. Plus 4 is 38 stitches. There you go. So now I know what we're doing for the Rowan Pure Wool Superwash worsted. Okay, one more. I'm going to sit here and do this, and then I'll just show you what I've done when I've finished. So this is Rowan Felted Tweed. There we go. So that's the end of that one. I messed up my stitches and my rows there, but I got it right in the end. So you can see very obviously, if you've got a thinner yarn, you've actually got to do a lot more stitches for a yarn swatch. But in so many ways, sometimes it really is worth the time. I only swatch sometimes because I know from experience that I knit so close to tension that I've never really had a problem. I only swatch these days if I'm testing out a yarn for my own designs, and it will be something like this. You can do square swatches if you are definitely taking a look at whether or not you're matching the gauge that someone is suggesting you knit to, for example, in patterns like these. Now then, what I will say is if you're a beginner, you're knitting a scarf, you just got your yarn, really do not hassle about this. It's just something to knit and it's great fun to knit it. If you're going to be someone who's concerned about whether or not you're on gauge, whether it's exactly the right size, then don't worry about it. As something that you're knitting, it doesn't really matter exactly what size it is. If it's a scarf that's, I don't know, supposed to be 60 inches long and it's 55 inches instead of 60, it doesn't matter. And if it's supposed to be 10 inches wide and it's 9.5 instead, that doesn't really matter either. So just be aware that as a beginner, it's not that important. And as something that you're knitting that isn't so dependent on size as, say, a fitted cardigan might be, then I would say don't worry about it either. But it really is good to get a feel of yarns. And if you're decluttering with us in the yarn declutter at the moment, then this will really help you go through your stash and go, do I like knitting with it? What do I think? Is it something I want to substitute for a yarn that's in a pattern and I can't find that yarn anymore? Then it's a really good way of testing out yarns like this. A simple gauge square will give you a good idea of whether it will match and substitute for another yarn. There you go. So that's my very rough way of figuring out how many stitches I need in a swatch. Okay, that looked a lot easier than maybe you thought it might be. When I actually sat down and did it, it felt easier than I thought it would be as well, because it looks kind of complicated sat there on the yarn ball band and all these numbers are sitting there, but you just have to add a few up and then figure out the rows that you have to knit as well, and you'll be there. Okay, so over the next couple of weeks we're going to talk a bit more about this. Next week I'm going to show you the yarns that I've knitted up into swatches, how I've created swatches when I'm creating new patterns, so that might inspire you to maybe figure out some patterns for yourself as well. And knitting up different patterns with your yarn also helps you realise whether or not you want to knit them up into different patterns, because you've got yarn in your stash, but is it suitable for knitting up different stitch patterns? That's what you might want to practice before you dive into your yarn stash in a bigger way and allocate the different yarns to different patterns. So if you do want to learn more about yarn substitution, which this kind of thing is really helpful for as well, then I've got a whole module all about that in the intuitive knitting course. Go over and have a look at that. So I'll link that here. I'll also link that below in the description too. Thanks so much for joining me today. Do join me again next week, where, as I've said, we'll be talking about all the different yarn swatches that I've knitted up and the stitch pattern swatches that I've knitted up to create some of my full knitting patterns. I'll see you for that. Bye for now. Happy knitting.